Thank you, praise man. And thank you everyone who's come to worship with us here at Temple Baptist Church today. Man, this is the first Sunday after Easter, and what a great day last Sunday was, wasn't it? The first time we had gathered for Easter in 2 years. The number of people we had, the visitors, guests, and friends hanging out with us. The praise band, man, they brought the music, and I was so proud. I was so very, very proud of us, and I think God was very pleased with our offering that we brought that day as well to honor His Son, resurrected from the grave. And this Sunday, as I mentioned, is Temple T-shirt Sunday. It's Decision Sunday, but it's also the Sunday where we try to encourage those who are reading through the Bible. And what I try to do, as I'm able to, if it fits into with what's going on at the time, I try to use a passage, focus on a passage that they've read through just recently to try to encourage and try to enhance their learning as they continue to read through the Scriptures. So today we're going to be talking about seeing ourselves, really seeing ourselves, because it's only as we see ourselves are we able to adjust our lives to what we see. You know, cosmetic companies latched onto this long time ago. I remember growing up, my mom, she always had this thing she had with her. It was called a compact, right? It's called a compact. And it was like a little round. It was flat. And on the bottom of it was powder, facial powder. On the top was a mirror, and there's a powder puff in there to help. But I was often remember we would go out, and before we would step into whatever social event we were getting ready to go to, Mom would often pause, open up her compact, look at herself, and then take the powder puff and apply the powder as she needed to make sure she looked good. She looked good stepping in that space. And the Army had this thing called a mirror, a mirror. And we would often use a mirror, especially when we had this thing called inspection in ranks. You know, in inspection ranks, what would take place is we'd go out to formation, and they'd line us up, and then they would say, open ranks march. And when they did, the first few ranks would take a step or a couple steps forward to create space between the ranks. The back ranks would take a step or a couple steps backward to create space between the back ranks. And then the platoon sergeant and platoon leader would go through the ranks, they'd go through the front, inspecting the front of a uniform, and then go behind you, inspecting your haircuts, the back of your uniforms, your shoes, medals, whatever the inspection was for that day. And if you did not meet up to standards, they were happy to tell you about it. And unfortunately, I was told about it more than on one occasion. But because you didn't want to be embarrassed or yelled at, before you ran out to your inspection in ranks, you would always stop at a mirror. You'd stop at a mirror to check yourself off, to make sure that all your buttons were buttoned, that your gig line was straight. And most of you won't know even what in the world that is. Woody knows what that is. Yeah? That's right. And Woody went through 1 or 2 inspections himself. And he probably did those inspections. And haircut, and make sure your hat was on right. And you always look for these things called ranger ropes. Ranger ropes. These were the threads that were hanging off your uniform. If you had a ranger rope, you'd either cut it off or burn it off. Because you wanted to make sure your uniform looked exactly right, so you'd look in the mirror so you could make the adjustments you needed to make before you went out to formation. They'd make the adjustments for you. And the compact and the Army mirror has become the cell phone. Now, I don't know about you, but I use my cell phone to take pictures of other people and other things. But I know a lot of people who use their cell phone to take pictures of themselves, almost exclusively of themselves. But beyond that, they use it as a mirror. And they use it to check off their teeth, their hair, their makeup, their eye, whatever. They check off things I never even knew existed, looking in their cell phones. You know, but all these things we do so that we can clearly see ourselves and make adjustments to our lives or whatever the activity is that we are involved with. And it's just as important for us to see ourselves before God so that we can make adjustments to our lives that we need to make in order to become the man and the woman of God He's created us to be. And Jesus, this morning, we're going to find Him teaching a large group of people, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, His disciples, a large crowd. And He's going to talk to them about this subject of seeing ourselves. And He begins by saying we need to see ourselves in our relationships with other people. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. As He's teaching, we read that to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. To some who were confident. Now, there's nothing wrong with being confident. I mean, I want you to hear that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being confident. I like confident people. I like my doctor to be confident in herself if I'm getting ready to undergo an operation. I want her to be so confident that she is sure that she can make me better. And I want her to be so confident that I am confident in her, that I believe in her as much as she believes in herself, that she can do what she needs to do to take care of whatever issue that I'm facing. And so I like my doctor to be confident. I especially like my dentist to be confident. I don't want a dentist who's not confident in himself. I want them to be 100% feeling it. They can take care of my teeth and make the pain go away. And when I step on an airplane, I'm checking out the pilot as he or she's walking on the plane. I'm looking at it. I'm watching how they walk. I want them to feel, Caden, I want you to feel confident about yourself, son. I want you to be confident. Everybody on that plane wants you to be confident. Do you walk on that plane? Because I want us to be able to believe that they're confident in what they can do, then that they can keep me safe while I'm up in the air and they're flying. So confidence is a good thing until it becomes a bad thing. Until we become so confident we move past the point of confidence to almost arrogance. Confidence becomes a bad thing when we become so sure of ourselves and in our abilities, too sure of our awesomeness and who we are and what we're else, too sure about ourselves, that we look around us and we realize, hey, no one else here is as awesome as I am, and we begin to look down on them and criticize them. And to some of the religious leaders who took pride in their religion, to some of the Pharisees, the religious leaders, who because of their position felt they had such spiritual power, to some who were confident in their own righteousness. Hear that word, their own righteousness. They owned their righteousness. They personally felt they were right enough, that they were good enough, that they were in love enough to be good with God. They saw themselves as being so good with God that no one else could be as good with God as they were. And they knew it. And they let other people know it. But the religious leaders were not as good with God as they thought because God was not good with them. And Jesus was getting ready and He was happy to point this fact out to them. And so He tells them a parable. He says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. How wonderful is that? 2 men went up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and a tax collector. Now, you could not be further apart on the spiritual spectrum, at least not as a society, as you could between a Pharisee and a tax collector. There was not any greater space than that. Because the Pharisees were seen to be really ultra-religious. They went to the temple every Sabbath. They knew the words to every praise song. They memorized half the Bible. They even spoke in King James. Thee, thou, thine, and thus saith the Lord. They had it down. They knew how to speak Christianese and say the right words and do the right things. And everyone looked up to the Pharisee because they were so spiritually awesome. And so, but then there was the tax collector. He never went to temple because he was not good enough to be let in. He couldn't carry tune much, less sing any of the praise songs. Cursed a lot, stole from a whole bunch of people. So everyone looked down on the tax collector. And the Pharisee stood up and prayed. Now, you can bet it wasn't in the back of the temple. I'm sure he stood up and prayed right up front. Like he would have been right here, right on the front row, and he would have stood up and prayed because he wanted to make sure everybody could see him and take note of that he was getting ready to pray. And he prayed loudly, and he waved his hands widely. He wanted to be the center of the attention he felt like he deserved. And when he prayed, notice, he prayed about himself. It was all about him. Man, don't you just love people who are all about themselves? What do those kind of people talk about? They talk about themselves. What are the things that they talk about? They talk about things they've done. Who else did they talk about? Nobody, because it's all about them. And he stood up to pray about himself. Right in the middle of the worship service, all about him. And what was he getting ready to pray? Pray about him, not about God, not even about God. Didn't even think about God. He was praying about himself. And notice what he prays. It says, God. Here, let me use my preacherly voice. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. The Pharisee needed to see himself in his relationships with others because his confidence in his own righteousness caused him to compare himself to people who he believed were worse than he was. But that's exactly what we do, isn't it? We don't compare ourselves to people better than us. That makes us feel bad about ourselves. What do? We like to compare ourselves to people who are not, we think that are not as good as us, not as talented as us, not as gifted as us. God, I thank you that you did not make me like all these other men, these robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector who has the audacity to come here and worship in the same space with me. But the Pharisee was wrong. He was absolutely wrong. He was just like all those others. The evildoers, the robbers, the adulterers, and even the tax collector. You see, because their sins were visible on the outside for other people to see, but the Pharisees' sins, they were on the inside for God to see. And he says, I'm so awesome, I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. All right, see, there's always a standard. There's always a standard by which we measure other people. And his standard was the standard about how much he tithed and how much he fasted. He fasted twice a week, went without food, didn't eat. Two times a week. He was only required to really do it by the law once a year on the Day of Atonement, but he did it twice a week. And his tithing giving his 10%, he was only required by the law to give a 10% of his produce, but he gave 10% of everything, every penny, every dollar, everything that he could think of down to the last mint leaf, anything he could come across, he would tithe. He was over the top in his fasting and tithing. These were the standards the Pharisee used to measure himself against other people. What is the standard you use to measure yourself against other people? Is it your looks? Is it how smart you are? Is it how talented you are? Is it how much you pray? Is it your own righteousness? Is it how often you come to church? What is the standard, and we all do this, what is the standard you use to measure yourself against other people? And do you use that standard as you put it against other people? Do you then use it so that you can look down at them? And we need to see ourselves in our relationships with others. But even more importantly than that is how we see ourselves in our relationship with God. Verse 13. But, in comparison, contrast, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The Pharisee stood up right where he was, right in the center of attention, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He stood in the back. He stood off the side. He stood away from everyone else because everyone else had always told him he was not worthy. He was not good enough. He was a tax collector. Everybody hated him. And because he was always told he's not worthy enough, he didn't even feel like he was worthy to be accepted and loved by God, and so he didn't even dare look up to heaven, but beat his breast, beat his chest right there where his heart was beating and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. God, I'm so sorry for living my life without you. Forgive me for making so many choices that I did not honor you. Many years ago, I remember when I received my calling to go into ministry. Carol and I were together. And I won't go into all the details, but we were left praying on our bed, beside our bed, about what He's wanted to do in my life. And I'm crying, and Carol's there beside me. And the one feeling that I had was just overwhelming, was unclean. Unclean. Dear God, the things I've done, the attitudes I have, the person I am, unclean, God, unclean. I'm not the man that and you want me to do what? But when we see God and we see who He is and what He's about and His purity and His magnificence and His glory, and we compare ourselves to Him, our relationship with Him, we have a better understanding of who we are in our lives. And like the tax collector, he saw God. And in seeing God for the first time, he accurately and clearly saw himself. He saw God as holy and pure, and he saw himself as a sinner in need of God's mercy. And because he saw himself, because he really saw himself, he adjusted his life and gave it all to God. And then I've got to believe there was a silence there almost. The Pharisee, the tax collector. What would Jesus say next? Would he validate what they had always thought and agree with what they always felt was true, that the Pharisee was really the spiritual person, the righteous person? Would he validate and go along with the crowd? Or would he come out on the other side, on the side that no one wanted to be on, to speak for this tax collector that everyone hated? Jesus says, I'm going to tell you this. I want you to know the truth of this situation of life, and that this man, this tax collector, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And this is the Sunday we've set aside for decision. I'm going to ask you would just to bow your heads, to enter to me with a time of prayer. And maybe for the first time today, on your spiritual journey, you've come to that point where you have seen God. You've seen Him. He has made Himself known to you. And there was a time in your life you did not believe in Him, did not think He even existed, did not think that God was a thing. But now God is becoming so much and so real to you. And your journey has taken an unexpected turn. That because you see God and who He is, you see yourself and who you are not. And you realize that you need to adjust your life. Just who you are. Say, God, forgive me, I'm a sinner. Forgive me for not living in life with you. Dear God, forgive me for not making decisions to honor you. Dear God, forgive me. And begin to see yourself and adjust your life. And like the tax collector, be all in for God. And you do that by saying, God, I give my life through your Son, Jesus. Say, Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, I give you my life. I give you all that I am, all that I have. I give you my today. I give you my tomorrow. I'll give you my future. I give you my heart. I give you my life. Jesus, I give you my life. And adjust your life to following Jesus. Or maybe today's a day of rededication for you. You know, you've cried out and received forgiveness and become a Jesus follower. But you've been following at a distance, not closely, at a distance, casually, not passionately. Your prayer would be, Jesus, help me follow you more. Help me love you more. Help me seek you more. Help me be the more you've called me and created me to be. And don't let me be any less than that, to come forward today and take my hand and say, Scott, pray for me. I want to rededicate my life. Or to join with our church family, our community, our people, to follow Jesus as we're following Jesus. To become a part of the best community, the community of Jesus followers of the Temple Baptist Church. Take my hand and say, Scott, I want to join your family. I want to join this church. I want to be part of this ministry. I want to make a difference in this world that you all are trying to make. This would be your time. I'll be standing here at the front. Carol will be playing softly. Just a few moments, and we're not going to drag this on out. But just for a few moments, for a chance to respond, to say yes. To say yes. As God leads you. As you adjust your life.